you had to pick one media voice that has been the most influential, the most respected among conservatives in the Trump era, you would almost certainly have to name Tucker Carlson. I don't really even think he has a close competitor for second place. From 2016 until 2023, basically all of the Trump era until just a couple of years ago, he occupied the 8 o'clock spot, which is the start of prime time on Fox News, the most watched cable network still. And in that spot at the 8 o'clock hour, Tucker's audience was larger, not just than any other person on cable news, but also larger than anyone had ever assembled in cable news. He really broke this mold where cable news is a dying medium, where it's almost entirely, it's not an exaggeration, people who are over the age of 54 or even 65 and increasingly 75 who now watch cable news. He had a significant portion of his audience that was much younger than that, very rare for cable. The show was a remarkable success, really historic in comparison to what cable news had done in the past, but especially with the disintegration of cable news, the rise of the independent media, what cable news had been doing over the last few years. It was a huge platform. Tucker has been around, of course, media forever, has been working on television for decades at CNN, MSNBC, at Fox, but this was really the moment when his influence really consolidated and grew as a sort of spokesperson, a media spokesperson at least, for the Trump movement, for a lot of its grievances. Certainly didn't agree with all of the views, but Tucker became not just extremely popular among conservatives, but really universally admired. If you go and look from 2016, 2017, when his show began, really putting up extremely significant ratings, when he grew the Fox audience, attracted people who really didn't watch cable news, younger people and the like, to his show because of how he was doing it and what he was saying. If you look at how he was talked about in conservative politics, you will be hard-pressed to find very many people publicly criticizing Tucker Carlson in conservative politics who had any sort of platform. I'm not saying you can't ever find a conservative saying, oh, Tucker Carlson said this the other night, I disagree with his views on that. He was a very outspoken, vehement opponent of Biden financing the war in Ukraine. There were a lot of Republicans who supported that, including ones in Congress. People certainly had no problem saying they disagreed with Tucker on that. Although opposition to that war in Ukraine became a very predominant conservative principle because it so clearly aligns with the America First ideology, namely that we shouldn't be spending our money anymore on fueling foreign wars, on helping foreign countries. We need to be spending it helping our own citizens and spending it within our crumbling communities. So it was a very consistent view of that war in Ukraine that he was vocally advocating from the start, and it aligned very well with America First. And even though a lot of people in D.C. wanted to support that war, including the Republican Party, the base of the Republican Party, a large contingent of it, started to turn against the war in Ukraine as well. Basically, until he was fired by Fox, and by all accounts, it had a lot to do with the fact that he was an opponent of not just financing the war in Ukraine, but the entire interventionist, endless war, neocon conservative policy that it represented, something that people like Rupert Murdoch, the owner of Fox News, has been an advocate of and continues to be for a long time. That was certainly a big reason Tucker got fired. He had the largest ratings of anybody on TV when he got fired. So when that happens, because ratings are usually the business, the bigger your ratings, the more money you make. If somebody gets fired when they're the top-rated show, you know almost certainly it's about something else. And this something else was the substance of his views. But up until that time, nobody really had a bad word to say about Tucker in conservative circles. Maybe it's because they had bad thoughts about him but didn't want to express it given how well-liked and admired he was. Or maybe people just viewed him as kind of a consensus figure that took all the different strains of the MAGA world and kind of united it for 1 hour at the start of Fox News' prime time. But whatever it was, there was certainly nothing controversial about Tucker within conservative politics. And now all of that has very radically changed. And what's so amazing about this radical change is usually when somebody's been around for as long as Tucker has, he's now in his mid to late 50s, been on television, as I said, for 30, 35 years. It's not really that usual for somebody to just instantly overnight become so polarizing in the political faction to which they have belonged their entire life. That's exactly what happened. And while we've seen this gradually happening, because after October 7th, the topic of Israel, which Tucker had almost always avoided, like a lot of people who work in media, who work in politics, people really had no reason to talk about Israel It hadn't been on the front burner since at least 2014, which is the last time the United States massively bombed Gaza. Nowhere near what they did over the last 2 years, but maybe back then, maybe a couple other occasions, but nowhere near what it's been for 2 years. So people had the luxury of just avoiding it. And people knew it was a thankless story to talk about. And most people you would see avoided it. And if they ever did talk about it, it was very much in passing, just to recite the sort of pieties about Israel that you had to affirm if you wanted to work in major media. And Tucker, that was true of him. Barely ever talked about Israel, barely ever did any work on Israel. I think visited Israel a couple times for a family vacation just because of its historic and religious features, but had no interest in Israel at all. And after October 7th, he felt like he had to. It was so central to our politics, not just the war, but everything happening in the United States as a result of October 7th and U.S. support for it. Protest and censorship as a result of declining U.S. support, massive amounts of money leaving the United States to go to Israel, the deployment of troops in that region to protect Israel, the bombing of Iran. Israel became absolutely massive, not just in terms of foreign policy, but domestic policy as well. So much of the Trump administration has been about punishing colleges for having professors too critical of Israel, for allowing students to be critical of Israel, expelling and deporting students who criticize Israel. Sometimes, yes, they were deported or expelled for protesting Israel, but not always. Members of Congress constantly go to Israel. They're constantly in Jerusalem, constantly at AIPAC, constantly tweeting about Israel. And of course, if you're somebody who believed in the America First movement, if you spent the last many years talking about it, you're at some point going to say, wait a minute, I thought this movement that I supported, that I was excited by, that I participated in, and remember, Tucker campaigned for Donald Trump throughout 2024, I thought this movement was about America first. And yet it seems like a huge part of our political class and our foreign policy is obsessed with Israel, focused on Israel, devoted to Israel. And he began raising questions that had been pretty common on the left and even in liberalism for a long time. These are things I've been talking about forever. But on the right, it was very rare for someone to do so, especially as somebody as a mainstream platform as Tucker. And you could see this coming. He was starting to become attacked by conservatives, prominent conservatives, and not just criticizing him or disagreeing with him, but denouncing him as an anti-Semite. And we're all big boys and girls who work in this profession. This is something you expect. You know it's going to happen. You can handle it. But over the last couple of weeks, it has really intensified. And it's worth looking at, not because Tucker Carlson's not going to be fine. He's going to be absolutely fine. If there's anyone who's going to be fine, it's Tucker Carlson. But because it says so much about the priorities of our discourse, how our debates about Israel function, the efforts being made to destroy people who try and raise debates, to clamp down on the ability to speak freely, the purchasing of media outlets by people who are fanatically pro-Israel, that this is something that you cannot avoid. And it's everywhere. All throughout the Sunday news shows, for example, members of Congress went on the network news stations, on cable news stations, and they were asked about Tucker's interview with Nick Fuentes, and you had multiple Republican members of Congress and the Senate denouncing Tucker Carlson as somebody who should be expelled from the conservative movement. So I just want to show you what precipitated this, but really as a way of understanding what the mindset is and just how pervasive this still is in our politics, more than ever. I would argue that as people's eyes have opened up, as people have been more critical of Israel than ever, expressing more criticism of Israel, the backlash and the crackdown and the attempt to destroy people's reputation has become far more, not just transparent, but far more extreme as well, because there's kind of a panic on the part of Israel supporters who have been able to maintain a real lockdown on bipartisan opinion in Washington that is now all crumbling and they don't know what to do. So about a week ago or so, on October 27th, Tucker Carlson interviewed Nick Fuentes. Nick has been on a lot of other shows prior to Tucker interviewing him. He was on our show, I guess about 6 weeks ago, was on Patrick Bet-David's show, that podcast that I just did when I was in Florida. He's been around because he has a very large following, principally of young men, of young disaffected men, young right-wing men, young conservative men. The show that he does, the America First show, is huge. Everywhere online, everything he does is viral. You ask people under 30 and they will know Nick Fuentes a lot more readily than what a lot of people would consider famous people in politics or media who are above the age of, say, 50, who nobody under 30 knows. You cannot deny his influence no matter what you think about him. And if someone is influential, the job of a journalist is to understand what their thought is, to understand their worldview, to challenge it in the places they think need challenging. And that's exactly what Tucker proceeded to do. So we had Nick Fuentes on the Tucker Carlson show, and here you see a thumbnail of it. This is from October 27th. And obviously Tucker's show is watched by a lot of people. It's the #2 podcast in the country after Joe Rogan. But I want you to take a look at the number of people who watched Tucker's interview with Nick Fuentes. And this is just on YouTube. This interview appeared on multiple platforms. I'm not even sure that YouTube is their most watched platform. It might be, but I know there's others like Spotify, Apple, X, and other places where these interviews appears that are watched by huge numbers of people as well. So just on YouTube alone, this interview with Nick Fuentes had 5.1 million views. And that's just in less than a week, nearly 5.2 million views in a week. There aren't many interviews, certainly political interviews, that get anywhere near that level, those kind of ratings, that level of attention. People are watching because they're interested. And they're interested because these topics matter to them. And they matter to them, and they're interested in this because Nick Fuentes has become an influential voice, no matter what your views are. And Tucker did what journalists should do. We put him on our show as well, and there was a huge amount of interest in that as well. Now, one of the things that happened once Tucker put Nick Fuentes on his show is there were a lot of people who have been really resentful of Tucker's influence in conservative politics, not just out of jealousy or not just out of personal spite because he attacked them, though there is a lot of that, but also ideologically. When I started off by saying that Tucker was almost never criticized in conservative political circles until he was fired at Fox, and even after that, it was really only once he started criticizing Israel and people started publicly criticizing Tucker, to the point that when Tucker was fired by Fox News, numerous Republican legislators in the Congress and the House of Representatives and in the Senate went to Politico to declare that they were so happy Tucker had been fired by Politico, and their reason was that he had made it more difficult to finance the war in Ukraine because his repeated, continuous critiques of that policy from Joe Biden made it harder for Republicans to keep funding the war in Ukraine because they had all their base. They would go to their constituents in town hall meetings and they would say, I thought we were America first. Why are we sending hundreds of billions of dollars to Ukraine? We need that here. And they felt a lot of pressure and a lot of impediment to do what Republicans, not all but most, wanted to do, which was support Joe Biden's policy of financing the war in Ukraine. But when they went to Politico to say how happy they were Tucker Carlson was fired and that things would be better now that he would no longer be on the air, they all did it anonymously. Not one had the courage to use their own name when saying that. Talking here about members of the House of Representatives and the Senate who are such cowards, they wouldn't criticize Tucker by name, even though they wanted to celebrate his firing from Fox because they wanted to fund wars and he made it harder. And that gives you the sense that I was talking about at the start, which is that criticizing Tucker in conservative media and political circles until he started talking about Israel basically wasn't done, not even by the people who are most powerful. After Tucker interviewed Nick Fuentes, a lot of people who Tucker had been very critical of, people like Ted Cruz, you probably remember that very aggressive and for Ted Cruz extremely embarrassing interview where Tucker interviewed Ted Cruz. A few months ago, Ted Cruz hasn't stopped talking about Tucker, attacking Tucker since. People like Dan Crenshaw, mostly like the pro-establishment, pro-war wing of the Republican Party that really believes in the traditional pre-Trump ideology of the Republican Party, but because you can't survive in Republican politics unless you pretend that you support Trump, they all pretend they like Trump. But they hate Trump's foreign policy instincts to the extent it's not interventionist. They hate his anti-free market economic policies like tariffs, but they can't really say it. But a lot of those people were the ones who hated Tucker, and Tucker has been very critical of them for supporting an ideology that it seemed like Republican voters wanted to dispense with. And they used Tucker's interview of Nick Fuentes as what they see as their opportunity to finally destroy Tucker. That's when this campaign exploded. Tucker is flirting with Nazism. He hates Jews. these are the kinds of things that conservatives have always expelled from the movement. William Buckley did it. This whole line that he's become a hate monger. He's become somebody beyond the pale of decency. This person who until 2 years ago was the consensus pick for probably certainly the most influential, maybe the most respected media voice for conservative politics and the MAGA movement has now become beyond the pale after questioning U.S. support for Israel for 2 years. Now, as a result, what happened was, after this interview with Nick Fuentes, after a lot of establishment Republican politicians started attacking Tucker and demanding that people disassociate with him, there was a rumor online that was spread that the Heritage Foundation, which has long been probably the most influential conservative think tank, scrubbed its site of all pages of its donation page that mentioned Tucker Carlson. And here was what was passed around, kind of had a before and after showing that it had previously mentioned Tucker in its page, and then someone tried to show that it had been removed. I'm not really sure if this ended up being accurate or not. There's a couple of different versions of claims about whether this really did happen, but the Heritage Foundation felt compelled because Tucker still has a gigantic following within the conservative movement, certainly more than people attacking him like Ted Cruz or Ben Shapiro do at this point. And the Heritage Foundation ended up in the middle of this, and they felt compelled to come out and say what it is that they think about all this. And the reason why this was not easy was because the Heritage Foundation has forever been fanatically pro-Israel. Basically, every influential mainstream group in Washington has been fanatically pro-Israel. And that includes the Heritage Foundation. But just like Megyn Kelly said about Charlie Kirk, where she said it became untenable for him to be so extremely and uncritically pro-Israel, given how much public opinion within younger conservative circles has changed. He couldn't have this huge breach between himself and the people Turning Point was purporting to represent. That's true for the Heritage Foundation as well. That's true for most people in conservative politics. They see the tide turning. And some of them are going to stick to that pro-Israel ship until it sinks, and others are trying to jump off of it. The Heritage Foundation's led by Kevin Roberts, who was a controversial pick, but he has been leading the Heritage Foundation. And he had to speak on what Heritage thinks about all this, about Tucker's criticisms of Israel, about his hosting Nick Fuentes, the allegations that his interview of Nick Fuentes wasn't nearly adversarial enough, that it was more friendly. And Kevin Roberts posted this statement on behalf of the Heritage Foundation about all this that added nations worth of fuel to what had already been the spreading fire. Here's what he said.
We will always defend truth. We will always defend America, and we will always defend our friends against the slander of bad actors who serve someone else's agenda. That includes Tucker Carlson, who remains, and as I have said before, always will be a close friend of the Heritage Foundation. The venomous coalition attacking him are sowing division. Their attempt to cancel him will fail. Most importantly, the American people expect us to be focusing on our political adversaries on the left, not attacking our friends on the right. I disagree with, and even abhor, things that Nick Fuentes says. But canceling him is not the answer either. When we disagree with a person's thoughts and opinions, we challenge those ideas in debate. And we have seen success in this approach as we continue to dismantle the vile ideas of the left. As my friend Vice President Vance said last night, what I am not okay with is any country coming before the interest of American citizens, and it is important for all of us, assuming we are American citizens, to put the interest of our own country first. That's where our allegiance lies, and that's where.
All right, so that is a remarkable statement, even though it's scripted, even though it's, of course, somewhat carefully worded. And the quoting of J.D. Vance, that J.D. Vance quote, is also remarkable. The fact that in the middle of controversy about U.S. support for Israel, major politicians like J.D. Vance, the Vice President of the United States, and then also the Heritage Foundation, a major conservative mainstream think tank, will stand up and affirm very loudly this view that our duty as Americans is not to put other countries before ours, but to put ours first. And to be saying that with reference to Israel, I know it seems unremarkable, maybe even seems obvious and benign, but that is not how American discourse relating to Israel has functioned. Saying that, even hinting that some people seem to have an eagerness to prioritize Israel above the United States was long considered completely taboo, anti-Semitic, and now people just can't avoid it any longer. Too many people see the reality that that's what's happening. And not only did the Heritage Foundation affirm that and quote J.D. Vance from doing so, he very clearly, vehemently defended Tucker, a longtime friend of the Heritage Foundation, who always will be, defended his interview of Nick Fuentes, saying, look, we don't like certain views that Nick Fuentes has, we even abhor some, but the solution is not to do what the left does and deplatform people or cancel, but to have an open debate. And essentially really strongly supported the primary objection that a lot of people on the right and the left have to this devotion to Israel, which is, it seems like, for whatever reasons, a lot of people put that country on the other side of this world, the world, this tiny little country, above our own. To say that this statement by the Heritage Foundation didn't go over well in a lot of establishment Republican circles is to understate the case quite a bit. It probably is the biggest scandal or crisis in the history of the Heritage Foundation. Huge numbers of people, conservatives, again, the mainstream types of conservatives, pro-Israel conservatives. It's important to remember and to always keep in mind in this context how large the anti-Israel faction has become within conservative circles. There's no way to marginalize people any longer who have that view because the number of people who hold that view is way too large to marginalize anybody who has it. But the Heritage Foundation got so attacked that they did a couple of things, including, as The Hill reported, on November 3rd, top Heritage Foundation staffer departs after Tucker Carlson Nick Fuentes controversy. Quote, Ryan Newhouse, who until Friday was chief of staff to Heritage Foundation President Kevin Roberts, left the conservative think tank in the wake of an uproar over a statement from Roberts last week defending Tucker Carlson after he interviewed white nationalist Nick Fuentes. Quote, Ryan was not fired. He offered his resignation, which was accepted, a Heritage spokesperson told The Hill on Monday. Not only that, from the Jewish Telegraphic Agency, November 3rd, remember, this is all about that statement we just played. Jewish lawyer quits Heritage Foundation's anti-Semitism task force over Tucker Carlson defense. Quote, Mark Goldfeder's public resignation comes amid a broad backlash to comments by Heritage President Kevin Roberts. Now, just this part alone is so fascinating. Remember, a major grievance of the American right over the last decade, a major principle that they upheld was that canceling people, deplatforming people, trying to silence people because of their views, especially when those views are representative of a lot of people's views, is a left-wing tactic of debate repression. And all the Heritage Foundation really did is affirm it in the context of Israel, of Nick Fuentes saying, look, we don't agree with Nick Fuentes in a lot of what he says. In fact, we abhor a lot of what he says. But of course, Tucker did nothing wrong in interviewing somebody with his influence. And this is so basic. I mean, journalists interview bad people all the time, if you think Nick Fuentes is qualified as that. They interview foreign leaders who are charged with war crimes, like Benjamin Netanyahu, or whoever, take your pick. Journalists interviewed Al-Qaeda leaders. Journalists interview all sorts of people. That's part of the job. And you ask them questions so that the public can make decisions about it. So all the Heritage Foundation did here is say Tucker was absolutely within his rights to talk to somebody like Nick Fuentes and ask him questions about his worldview, given his influence. Number two, everybody has the right to question a foreign country, any foreign country. We even have the right to question our own government. If we have the right to question our own government, of course we have the right to question Israel. That was it. And for those two previously uncontroversial points, but extremely controversial when applied to the case of Israel and people who question support for Israel in the United States, that not only becomes controversial, but radioactive to the point people are quitting and losing their jobs. And it's absolutely driving a massive wedge inside the conservative movement. Thanks for watching this clip from System Update, our live show that airs every Monday through Friday at 7 p.m. Eastern, exclusively on Rumble. You can catch the full nightly shows live or view the backlog of episodes for free on our Rumble page. You can also find full episodes the morning after they air across all major podcasting platforms, including Spotify and Apple. All the information you need is linked below. We hope to see you there.